After 6 years since the release of Breath of the Wild, and 4 years after the initial announcement of a sequel, Tears of the Kingdom was finally released to massive fanfare and acclaim from fans, critics, and even people who had never played a Zelda game before. The game was an absolute sensation on release, with many people, myself included, thinking it was an unquestioned instant game of the year, despite it only being May. Tears of the Kingdom was supposed to be the definitive Zelda game, the magnum opus of Zelda Team and perhaps even Nintendo's biggest and greatest game ever. And all the praise and love the game got is completely justified. Tears of the Kingdom, by any normal standards, is a masterpiece. However, if you're anything like me, you haven't touched Tears of the Kingdom in a long time. You put a few dozen, maybe even hundreds of hours into the game in the first few months, but now it's been sat there gathering dust for upwards of a year. Why is that? Why is it that such a huge, hyped and incredibly successful game has all but been forgotten in just over a year? There's very little YouTube content on Tears of the Kingdom like there was Breath of the Wild. It seems like Tears of the Kingdom has been largely forgotten, while its predecessor continues to be spoken about to this day. What went so wrong with Tears of the Kingdom? This video is just my personal views and opinions as to why Tears of the Kingdom fails as a sequel to Breath of the Wild. You may agree with me, you may not. We may meet in the middle. Whatever your views and opinions are about these games, I hope you at least hear what I have to say. This is why Breath of the Wild is better. On paper, Tears of the Kingdom is by far and away the superior game to Breath of the Wild. Tears of the Kingdom has significantly more enemy types, it has more enemy variants, and it's got overall more things to fight than Breath of the Wild, which creates for much more varied and interesting combat scenarios. Tears of the Kingdom has more quests and more characters to keep you busy and give you goals to achieve. Tears of the Kingdom has more points of interest and things to discover than Breath of the Wild, making its map more interesting, alive and full. Speaking of the map, Tears of the Kingdom has a significantly larger map, with the caves, the Sky Islands and the depths all being new additions on top of the old Hyrule. Tears of the Kingdom has more items, and it has more things to do with those items. It's got more fleshed out abilities, it's got more dungeons, more mini-games, more shrines, and it's even got more core rocks. On paper, Tears of the Kingdom absolutely clears Breath of the Wild in basically every metric. And yet, despite all this, I still prefer Breath of the Wild. So what makes Breath of the Wild better than Tears of the Kingdom, despite all the advantages Tears of the Kingdom has over its predecessor? Tears of the Kingdom begins with a long prelude sequence that establishes a lot about the story and adventure you're about to partake in. This intro sequence is about 10 or so minutes long, and is essentially nothing more than an extended cutscene. You have full control over Link, but there's nothing really to do. You're at the mercy of Zelda's predetermined walk speed, as she points out a few details of where you are and gives a little bit of context to why you're down there. She says a weird, malice-like substance called gloom has been making people ill, and wants to discover the source of the gloom to solve the problem. Once finding the source of the gloom, that being the corpse of Ganondorf, you're treated to a 3-minute long, unskippable cutscene. This cutscene isn't bad by any means, but I fail to understand why it's completely unskippable. It's unskippable on a first playthrough, and it's unskippable on a 15th. On every single replay of the game, you have to sit through the entirety of this long cutscene just to reach the starting room of the game. After all of this, you wake up in the Room of Awakening and the tutorial begins. On a first playthrough, this is an incredible piece of world building and storytelling. I was genuinely invested in this game's story from the first time I opened it up because of this intro sequence. However, it greatly affects the replayability of Tears of the Kingdom. More on that later. Breath of the Wild does also have a short intro sequence. It's a few lines of dialogue from Zelda while Link wakes up. After that, you're in the Shrine of Resurrection, and the tutorial of Breath of the Wild begins. This may seem like a small difference, but it takes over 10 minutes of dialogue, cutscenes, and scripted events for Tears of the Kingdom to reach the starting point of Breath of the Wild. You may be wondering why I'm putting so much focus onto the length of each game's intro sequences. Well, that's because it takes significantly longer to acquire the paraglider in Tears of the Kingdom than it does in Breath of the Wild. The paraglider being the item that signifies the end of the tutorial in both games. The huge increase in the time it takes to acquire the paraglider in Tears of the Kingdom, I believe, greatly impacts the replayability value of the game. Now you're probably sat there thinking, but Linguini, it's only 10 minutes, that's such an irrelevant amount of time, you're over-exaggerating. Well, let's continue with each game's tutorial areas and see just how much longer Tears of the Kingdom takes to truly begin. Both games have you move towards the Temple of Time. They're different temples, both called the Temple of Time, just roll with it. And at the temple, you meet a past king of Hyrule. The kings tell you you must complete 4 shrines and then return to the temple to complete the tutorial area of each game. I kinda just lied, because in Tears of the Kingdom you do 3 shrines, then go back to the temple, then get told to do another shrine, and then come back again. But whatever, you complete the 4 shrines, return back to the temple, and complete the starting tutorial area. Now free to explore Hyrule to your heart's content. In Breath of the Wild, that is. While you aren't technically able to explore Hyrule as you please after completing the Great Sky Island, in Tears of the Kingdom you'll have a very hard time getting much of anything done, as you aren't actually given the paraglider when you jump off of the Sky Island. This is where Tears of the Kingdom's intro really starts to drag on in subsequent playthroughs. What now follows to get the paraglider is you have to go to Lookout Landing and speak with Purah. Side note here, Tears of the Kingdom gets a point for adult Purah. You know exactly why. After speaking with Purah, you then have to run halfway up Hyrule Castle to speak with some random NPC who you never see again. This is so the game can set up the mystery of Zelda making appearances throughout Hyrule, which on a first playthrough is very interesting and I like it a lot. On replays, not so much. After seeing Zelda, you then have to run back to Lookout Landing, talk to Purah some more, and then you get the paraglider. Finally, after all of that, you're free to do whatever you please. To sum this all up, I started a new save on both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom to time how long it took me from booting up the game to getting the paraglider. Breath of the Wild took me about 30 minutes, not too long if you want to boot up a new save and get through the plateau as fast as possible to get to the real game. Tears of the Kingdom took over 70 minutes from booting the game to getting the paraglider. That is a significant time investment if you want to do multiple playthroughs of the game to simply finish the tutorial. I understand that this was done for world building and to set up the game's story, and I think it absolutely succeeds at what it sets out to do, but it comes at a huge cost to the game's replay value. I couldn't tell you how many times I've replayed Breath of the Wild because it's so quick and easy to get off the plateau. I've only gotten to the paraglider in Tears of the Kingdom twice. It is my opinion that the runes you're given in Breath of the Wild are absolutely perfect for the world you're thrown into. Well, that is with the exception of Cryonis. While Cryonis isn't a bad addition to the game, it definitely feels half-baked when compared to the other 3 runes. However, I will give it the fact that you can do this with Cryonis. It's not very useful, but it is very funny, and I'll go into much more detail about how this works much later into the video. Magnesis is probably the second worst rune, and for most people I feel like Magnesis is also very underwhelming. It lets you pick up and move metallic objects. What's there to be so excited over? Well, I'm not most people, as you will come to figure out as this video progresses. No, the reason I love Magnesis is for all the silly, janky scenarios it creates. If you're confused, which if you want a nerd like me, you should be confused, Magnesis gives Link and whatever he is currently holding an infinite amount of mass. This means that no matter how big an object is, you can move it. Better yet, you can move it like it's made of paper. The amount of silly scenarios this creates is amazing, from simple things like pushing annoying things out of the way, to letting you pick up guardians with nothing but a tiny metal sword. It's what makes Magnesis such a good rune, and this is sorely missing from Tears of the Kingdom, as I will get to later on. However, before I get into that, we have to talk about the best runes in both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, starting with remote bombs. On the surface, bombs seem like two very weak, very niche offensive and utility tools. They can be used to ward off enemies but deal little damage. They can be used for things like chopping down trees quickly. Sometimes enemies will kick the bombs like a ball, but other than that they're pretty useless. So why am I saying that they're one of the best runes across both games? The answer is incredibly simple. Bomb Impact Launches. Bomb Impact Launches, more commonly known as a wind bomb, and I will refer to them as a wind bomb from now on, are the single most useful, most versatile movement tech in either Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. BLSS users can fight me in the comments on that one. If you don't know what a wind bomb is, I'll quickly explain it to you. A wind bomb is a piece of movement tech exclusive to Breath of the Wild, where you jump off a ledge, drop a bomb, enter bullet time, drop a second bomb, explode the first bomb, and have the explosion launch the second bomb into the back of Link, which ultimately sends him flying in the sky at speeds not possible by intended means. This takes a little bit of practice to pull off, but once mastered it makes traversing Hyrule much easier and much faster, all while being fun to pull off. I cannot overstate how useful wind bombs are to movement in Breath of the Wild. They give you huge amounts of height, huge amounts of speed, huge amounts of distance, all while being fun and satisfying to pull off, and you can do it from practically anywhere. See that ledge? You can wind bomb. See that tree? You can wind bomb. Flying through the air after a wind bomb? Guess what? You can chain wind bombs mid-air. It may not be an intended mechanic, but as you will come to learn, Breath of the Wild is a game that is made by its unintended mechanics. Finally, for Breath of the Wild's runes, we have Stasis. You don't need to be like me and exploit the game's physics engine to understand why Stasis is so well loved universally. You click a thing, you freeze it in time, you can store up the momentum in the object by hitting it, and watch it go flying when the timer runs out. This can be used for movement or for combat, or just for simply moving something out the way. Already, Stasis would be an incredible rune if it just had the functionality to freeze and move objects, but with the Stasis Plus upgrade, you can gain the ability to freeze enemies as well. This is an absolute game changer, because there are no limitations to what enemies you can freeze. You can freeze every single enemy in the game. The only difference is, larger enemies will be frozen for less time. While frozen, any damage an enemy takes will be stored, similar to momentum for frozen objects, and when the timer runs out, the enemy will take all of the stored damage in one go. This lets you extend combos on enemies, rack up free damage, prevents the enemy from attacking you, and personally, I would say it most importantly can reset an enemy to its neutral state after they take damage. What I mean by this is basically you can cancel attacks with Stasis. A Guardian will reset its laser, a Lionel will stop an attack, a Bokoblin will probably just eat shit and die. Not much changes with Bokoblins there. Stasis thrives as a combat tool that beautifully complements every single weapon type in the game, and just as with the infinite mass Magnesis gives you, this is another sorely missed mechanic in Tears of the Kingdom. Tears of the Kingdom follows in Breath of the Wild's footsteps by introducing 4 new runes into the game as replacements for the runes in Breath of the Wild. These 4 runes to most people are far more complex and in-depth than Breath of the Wild's runes. Ultra Hand lets you build anything that your imagination can come up with. Fuse lets you take 2 random objects and make weapons or tools out of them. Rewind lets you take anything and retrace their steps for a considerable amount of time, letting you access new areas or fix mistakes you probably made trying to build something with Ultra Hand. And finally, Ascend lets you quickly and easily exit caves or structures with the press of a button and a short animation. On paper, these runes are all much more advanced and sophisticated than the runes presented in Breath of the Wild, and to be fair, they are. Mostly. Much like Cryonis, Ascend feels a little underwhelming. It solves a unique issue created by Tears of the Kingdom's greater focus on verticality, and it solves that problem well. The game would undoubtedly be more annoying without it, but for it to be one of the 4 main runes of the game that define the experience, it's kinda lame. You press the button, you go through a ceiling. That's it. Like I said, it's the Cryonis of Tears of the Kingdom. There's not much to talk about with either rune. Rewind is up next, and it does what it says on the tin. It rewinds time for an object. The parallels to stasis here are very clear. It's a yellow rune that affects time on an object. I actually really like Rewind. I remember seeing it in trailers and just imagining the possibilities with such a powerful ability. There is, however, one big issue that holds the rune back from being amazing. It doesn't work on enemies. Why doesn't it work on enemies? Like, seriously, why doesn't it work on enemies? Rewind is clearly supposed to be Tears of the Kingdom's version of stasis, and the best part of stasis is the fact that you can freeze enemies. So why can't you rewind enemies? For me, it's just such a massive waste of potential, such a cool ability. Imagine the possibilities if you could rewind enemies. You could stop a charging Lionel, send it backwards. You could reverse Gloomhands to make a desperate escape, or you could rewind a Bokoblin off a cliff. Why can't I rewind a Bokoblin off a cliff, Nintendo? Let me ruin this stupid pig thing's day. Because you can't rewind enemies, the rune just ends up being used as another means to an end, instead of providing unique and creative gameplay interactions. I only use rewind when I accidentally drop something off a cliff, or I want to recall a Vator up a wall instead of climbing. Side note, if you don't know what a recall elevator is, it's when you use Ultra Hand to raise a platform into the air, stand on it, recall the platform you're standing on and quickly grab a second platform to raise even higher, rinse and repeat, and then boom, you get infinite height. This is a really cool thing you can do with Rewind, and I would absolutely be praising this tech more if it wasn't for a certain something that makes it mostly useless. I'll talk about that something later. Other than these situations, I don't use recall almost ever. It sits there waiting for the specific scenario of me dropping something off a cliff, or recalling falling sky rocks that always end up going nowhere. It feels like a huge ball of missed potential. Fuse is actually pretty good for the most part. It's a very simple concept that gives a ton of depth through the huge number of items and objects you can fuse together. The combinations are seemingly endless. You can put an eye on an arrow and boom, homing arrow. You can put a giant wooden panel on a stick and boom, Korok leaf at home. You can slap a wet slab of meat onto a rusty old sword you found from underneath a rock and boom, you have a biohazard. Fuse replaces the old weapon system of Breath of the Wild, where instead of finding better weapons laid out across Hyrule and used by monsters, you can now almost exclusively find a bunch of dog shit around Hyrule. Of course, you use Fuse to turn the dog shit into good shit. You can make almost anything you can think of using Fuse, and I think for the most part it's an amazing addition to the game. It's weighed down slightly by the fact that to fuse two objects, you need to physically place one of them in the world. You can't fuse within the menu for some reason. It's not a massive issue, but it is just a bit weird and it slows down the pace of the game. Like, imagine you're in a fight and your weapon breaks because it was a stick and a rock glued together with some shoelaces and old gum, and then to make a new weapon, you need to select another weapon, go back into your menu and find whatever you want to fuse to it, grab the item, drop it on the floor while the enemies look at you wondering where everything went wrong, and then you can fuse them together to have your new weapon. Now compare that to Breath of the Wild, where swapping the weapons was as easy as... yeah, it's just a bit weird. Oh, also, the arrow menu, oh my god. Ultra Hand is a very mixed bag. On one hand, I can see the huge amount of freedom and creativity, the ability to manipulate and glue together almost every object in the game. It's absolutely incredible, and it's an amazing feat of game design. Ultra Hand lets you create literally anything. I've seen people make all sorts, from working trains to logic circuits, Korok waterbody and crucifixion devices. This... the addition of Zonai devices add a whole other layer to the rune, as these devices are what allow for vehicles to be made. There are so many different devices that can be used on so many different objects to create endless different variations of vehicles to make moving around Hyrule easier and faster than ever before. After you get past the hurdle that is actually building anything in the first place. Yeah, the end result is really cool. But oh my god, is Ultra Hand not the clunkiest rune in either of these games? The rune is very similar to Magnesis in that Link shoots out a magical beam that attaches to whatever object you've clicked on, and then you can move the object around freely. Except if you remember from earlier, Magnesis gave Link infinite mass. Ultra Hand doesn't do that. That doesn't sound like a big issue at first until you realise that in Breath of the Wild, Magnesis gave you infinite mass for a reason. It's incredibly annoying to have to move objects out of the way to actually move what you want to move. So in Breath of the Wild, Magnesis gives Link infinite mass so you can just move anything and everything out of your way like it's nothing. Nintendo decided to remove this from Ultra Hand in Tears of the Kingdom. I can only assume they did this because of all the silly things people managed to do with the infinite mass in Breath of the Wild, but it doesn't only remove all of that. Now you can't pick up a boulder if there's a leaf on top of it. If you want to build anything, you're obviously going to need to rotate the object, and Nintendo provides a decent solution to the problem. The rotation mechanic gets some getting used to, but it works good enough. The whole appeal of Ultra Hand is the ability to make intricate, complex, and just big machines with nothing but the objects you collect as you play the game. But in reality, making anything bigger than 5 parts takes a really long time and grinds the game to a complete halt while you bash your head against the wall until everything rotates together properly. Much like Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom rewards you with unique abilities based off of in-game characters at the end of each major dungeon. However, Tears of the Kingdom takes a much different approach to how you activate the abilities compared to Breath of the Wild. To activate the champion abilities in Breath of the Wild, you simply had to have an ability that was off cooldown and hold down a specific button. Hold jump for Rivali's Gale, hold shield for Daruk's protection, hold a charge attack for Urbosa's Fury, and Mipha's Grace was an automatic activation upon death. These abilities felt like extensions of already existing mechanics in the game. Holding the defend button gives you a defensive shield around you. Holding the charge attack button gives you a massive, powerful burst. These abilities were simple and quick to activate, and you were always aware of when you had access to them because of the number of charges you had left, and the cooldown of each ability was always displayed right under your health. The champion abilities are both incredibly versatile and incredibly fluid and seamless to activate. The sages in Tears of the Kingdom take everything good about the champion abilities and throw it out the window. As you complete the game's dungeons, the companions you complete them with give you a weird blue hologram version of themselves to follow you around and fight alongside you. These blue sage thingies are what give you their respective abilities. To activate them, you need to stand next to the sage and press the A button. Simple enough, right? In theory, this is a neat idea. You walk up to your companion and directly get their abilities from them. In actual gameplay, the sages are mind-numbingly annoying to go up and activate. They run off and go fight every little bokoblin that dares breathe within a 6-mile radius of you, and when you call them back to your location, they run towards you, until you get close enough to activate their ability, and then they start running the other way. It's so clunky, I literally never use the sages for combat, which sucks because they have some incredibly interesting combat abilities. Riju can stun large numbers of enemies, Yunobo can send enemies flying, Sidon can give you a nice water shield, and Tulin will blow all your items off a cliff. And then Mineru's just like, over there, fuck you Mineru, I hate you, go away. The sage abilities are less annoying to activate outside of combat, but they're also less useful. Usage of the sages boils down to 99% spamming Tulin's ability while gliding, and then occasionally you'll tell Yunobo to go smash a rock. The sages themselves can attack directly, but for the most part they're so weak it's not very noticeable. In Breath of the Wild, I find myself always using the champion abilities basically off cooldown because they're just that useful. In Tears of the Kingdom, I usually have the sages turned off with the exception of Tulin because he is actually useful, to be fair. When put next to the champion abilities of Breath of the Wild, the sages in Tears of the Kingdom are just kind of useless. One of the biggest selling points of Tears of the Kingdom was spread all over the marketing material for the game was the inclusion of the new Sky Islands. These islands were shown off as a whole new layer of the game, a focus of verticality that wasn't really explored in Breath of the Wild. These islands promised a brand new experience to supplement the fact that we're going back to the same Hyrule as before. The opening of the game, as much as I criticised the length earlier, shows off just how good these Sky Islands could be. Large islands with several different layers, adding up to be a similar size to the Great Plateau, offered an amazing experience that left me wanting more after I jumped off the first Great Sky Island. But I would never get any more. I distinctly remember getting the map of Central Hyrule, looking at the sky section of the map, wondering where all the islands were. I thought perhaps they had to be discovered to appear, or you had to get within a certain distance as to not spoil the surprise. Of course I know now that the Sky Islands are just disappointing. There's hardly any islands, and when there are islands they're usually the same 3 or 4 small copy-pasted shrine islands. There are 2 temples that I'll get into later, and there are a handful of unique and interesting, if small, island formations, but the vast majority of islands are the same few copy-pasted tiny archipelagos. There are no less than 10 copy-pasted shrine quests in the sky. I mean straight up, copy-pasted. The same quest, the same islands, the same thing, again and again. The verticality aspect is hardly even used, other than with the initial challenge of getting up so high in the first place. The island archipelagos are typically all within the same rough heights of each other, so the entire verticality aspect is barely used within the already barely used Sky Islands. From what I've seen, this is one of the most common and largest issues people have with Tears of the Kingdom. The focus on the Sky Islands in the game's marketing and promotion really did not help with the sheer disappointment of what we got in the final product. The Sky Islands are on the game's cover, for God's sake, and yet they are possibly the single most half-baked and underwhelming part of this game. The methods of getting up to the islands is also incredibly one-dimensional and gets stale really quickly. The islands are so high in the sky so that there's almost no room for creativity of how you reach them. Instead of climbing a tall mountain to gain a vantage point, or coming up with an interesting vehicle to get you all the way up there, you'll probably just end up teleporting to any of the sky shrines you've unlocked, or any of the Skyview towers you've unlocked to make your way up there. And from there, you'll probably end up just making a hoverbike and then hopping from island to island. The Sky Islands are simply too high up to allow for any room for creativity. For the vast majority of the game, you don't have access to the resources to make your way up that high. The game attempts to offer a solution to this. In the first gameplay showcase, the director of the game, Eiji Aonuma, shows off how rocks will occasionally fall from the sky, and using the rewind ability on them, you could ride all the way back up to the sky. This would be an incredibly helpful addition to the game that would give a much needed alternative method of getting up to the sky. Unfortunately, in my experience of playing Tears of the Kingdom, this has never actually worked a single time. Yes, rocks fall from the sky, and yes, you can rewind them a significant distance, but I have not once had a falling rock rewind all the way up to a sky island like in the gameplay demo. Yes, I know this weird sky launcher thing exists, but you're not about to tell me that this is a convenient way to make it up to the sky. Is it funny though? Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty funny. Of course, Tears of the Kingdom has a whole other layer of the world to explore that Nintendo kept as quiet as possible during the game's marketing cycle. While Nintendo hyped up and focused on the Sky Islands, they kept absolutely silent about the even larger world that they had hidden below the surface of Hyrule. The reason they decided to keep this quiet is, in my eyes, obvious. By keeping the depths a secret, it allowed us all to collectively discover it at our own pace and in our own unique ways. My personal experience of discovering the depths is something I won't forget. I had just jumped off the Great Sky Island and was excited to explore this new Hyrule. Me being the idiot I am, I decided that instead of walking to the giant Skyview Tower in Lookout Landing, I was going to turn around and go to the Great Plateau. Don't ask. On the plateau, I discovered one of this game's many chasms. Initially, I shrugged it off as a silly joke by the developers, because, obviously if you jump in, you're going to avoid out like you always do when jumping into holes you shouldn't. Now imagine my surprise when I didn't void out. Now imagine how much more surprised I became when Link turned into a red paste upon reaching the bottom. There was something down there. I didn't know what yet, but I knew that something was there. Suddenly the Sky Islands and Hyrule were second thoughts. All I wanted to do was jump into another hole with the paraglider and find out what on earth was hiding down in the darkness. I can't overstate how incredible of an experience this was. The entire gameplay loop of jumping down into a chasm, hearing the trumpets blare as you land down in this dark alien world, stumbling around in the dark, wondering where the next cliff or enemy is lying, until you spot a light route in the distance. That experience was amazing. I loved the depths a lot, which is why it's such a shame that after you turn on all the light routes, the biggest flaw of the depths is now completely exposed. The perpetual darkness hid the fact that the depths is all one biome. There is no variation, no unique terrain, no unique plants, no unique nothing. Other than the area around the fire temple, which adds some lava, how brave, the entire depths is nothing more than a grey inversion of Hyrule. Around the depths you can discover many points of interest, such as boss fight you've already done. Boss fight you've already done. You can hideouts 1 through, 40? There's the same 5 points of interest copy and pasted all over the depths with little to no variation between them, just like how the Sky Islands are copy and pasted together. What was once something I was genuinely captivated by and longing to discover all of the secrets within, suddenly became something I could predict just by opening the map and looking for the same shapes I've already found 5 times. Just like the Sky Islands, there are a handful of unique and interesting ideas found within the depths, but these are few and far between. I really liked the depths for my first 50 or so hours of playing Tears of the Kingdom, but after that it became something I only really interacted with when I needed Zonite to auto-build a hoverbike. I want to make it clear that I do like the depths. I like them a lot, which is why most of this section was spent praising the depths and talking about how much my initial experience of them impacted my first playthrough of Tears of the Kingdom. The reason I'm being so critical of them is because, like the Sky Islands or Rewind, I think the depths had so much potential that was just thrown away with the stale and repetitive world we got. The depths make a game that was in development for 6 years somehow feel rushed. It's that disappointing. A little while into development of Tears of the Kingdom, it was announced that the game would be going back to the same Hyrule as Breath of the Wild. This announcement sparked mixed feelings among the community. Some people were incredibly happy and excited to go back to this world and see what's changed, and how the kingdom has rebuilt since the defeat of Calamity Ganon. So many questions were raised over what could have happened to rebuild Hyrule. What was done with all the Guardian parts? How could each of the main settlements grown and changed over the years? Have some of the old ruins littered across the land been cleared away, or even started being restored back to how they were before the Calamity? On the other hand, the same Hyrule meant that we already know a lot of the key points of interest, and the exploration aspect of the game will be severely determined by how much you've already explored Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. Initially, I was part of the group of people who were excited to go back and see what's new, what's different about Hyrule after defeat of the Calamity. But this excitement quickly disappeared as I played the game. The problem with returning to the same world as Breath of the Wild isn't that nothing has changed, because that simply isn't true. The issue comes with the fact that there's no sense of exploration anymore. Breath of the Wild managed to capture an endless feeling of anticipation of what was going to be around the next turn, over the next mountain and across the next river. Every little thing you discovered was interesting, because it was something new. In Tears of the Kingdom, you already know where everything is. Sure, it may be different to how it was in Breath of the Wild, but for the vast majority of the game, you'll be expecting something to be somewhere you look. There is no sense of exploration. Instead of anticipation, there's an expectation that something will be there because something was there in Breath of the Wild. Walking around at the world of Tears of the Kingdom simply isn't exciting, because I have a rough idea of what's gonna be around the corner. The issue is exacerbated if you're like me and spent hundreds of hours exploring Hyrule in Breath of the Wild. Because now, in Tears of the Kingdom, nothing's a surprise anymore. There's no mystery when exploring Hyrule in Tears of the Kingdom. Instead, it feels like I'm going from place to place, ticking off a checklist of places in Breath of the Wild that I'm now going to look at in Tears of the Kingdom, just because they had stuff in Breath of the Wild. Half of the fun of exploring in Breath of the Wild was the discovery of dozens of little small structures with a couple of little NPCs or a little thingy to do. But in Tears of the Kingdom, that discovery is completely gone. Discovering Selmie's spot isn't interesting now that I know where Selmie's spot is. Expand that to the entire game and you basically have my point. I must say, however, I like the addition of caves. Caves managed to solve the issue of just revisiting already known locations by literally carving out new locations into the map. Most of these caves are small little 1 or 2 room things with a bit of loot and some enemies. Some caves are much bigger and have multiple branching paths and can cut through entire mountains with several hidden goodies to find inside. The best example of this is the cave that connects Lookout Landing to Hyrule Castle. The cave system is absolutely massive, with tons of different paths to take, all sorts of different verticalities used, and a whole mini-boss to fight. Lots of chests to find. I wish more of the caves were like this, because unfortunately this is the exception to the rule. It's not a massive issue because for the most part, caves are a rather small addition to the game, and the expansion of most of them would add relatively little to the experience. Nonetheless, I'm happy that they're in the game, and they do actually add something new to the old Hyrule we explore in Tears of the Kingdom. The shrines in Breath of the Wild got a lot of criticism for their implementation. Many people felt that the shrines were mostly underwhelming, typically too short and too easy to fully make up for Breath of the Wild's lack of traditional Zelda dungeons. The design of the shrines being homogeneous throughout every single shrine in the game is also a large point of criticism, as people got sick and tired of looking at the same 4 walls for all of the 120 shrines in Breath of the Wild. How does Tears of the Kingdom address this criticism and seek to solve the issues of Breath of the Wild? It doesn't. In fact, Tears of the Kingdom makes all of the issues of the shrines in Breath of the Wild even worse. Let's start with the visuals. Every shrine still looks the exact same as each other. The difference here being there are now more shrines than before. And I personally think the shrine design in Tears of the Kingdom is worse than Breath of the Wild. I'm not saying the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom look bad, They're perfectly fine and I don't hate them, but I think that the grey and green aesthetic that Nintendo went for the shrines in Tears of the Kingdom just pales in comparison to the blue and grey with some orange highlights that Breath of the Wild went with. The exterior of the shrines is honestly no contest. I mean, really. I like the door of the Sky Shrines, but the Sheikah Shrines are just so much more visually striking and interesting than a literal rock. The Sheikah Shrines have a lot more depth within their walls than the Tears of the Kingdom shrines, with the Sheikah Shrines being incredibly uneven and jagged, with no two walls properly lining up. Meanwhile, all the walls and the ceiling in Tears of the Kingdom are very smooth, very flush, and I just prefer the look of Breath of the Wild's shrines much more to the Tears of the Kingdom shrines. Most shrines take a single concept and present a handful of different challenges that take that concept and apply it in different ways. Some shrines are very short, some are pretty long, and most are in the middle somewhere. But something that both games share are blessing shrines, tutorial shrines, and combat shrines. Beginning with the combat shrines, these got a lot of flack in Breath of the Wild because they're all the same thing. You enter a shrine, one of 3 mini guardians that vary in strength will appear, you kill it, and that's the shrine. Tears of the Kingdom actually does address this very well, with the combat shrines in Tears of the Kingdom all being unique and actually some of the most memorable shrines in the game, which is a massive contrast to the forgettable tests of strength in Breath of the Wild. Unfortunately, the tutorial shrines go in the complete opposite direction. In Breath of the Wild, you had one tutorial shrine at Kakariko Village, a location that most players will visit within the first 2 to 3 hours of the game. This shrine is not only a location that means it will be genuinely helpful for explaining some of the more niche combat mechanics to new players, but it explains those mechanics in a very short and concise manner. One shrine to explain the mechanics. That's all. Tears of the Kingdom decide to completely forego all of this. There are numerous different shrines all over Hyrule that all only explain one mechanic each. They're also all placed seemingly randomly around the map, so you could stumble upon a tutorial shrine 40 hours into the game and have it be completely wasted on you. The quantity of these shrines is the main issue here. Where Breath of the Wild used a single shrine to explain one of the more important combat mechanics to you, like flurry rushing and parrying, Tears of the Kingdom decided it needs about a dozen shrines to explain all of the most niche concepts from crouching to shooting an arrow in bullet time. These shrines are simply not needed, and a clear filler for Tears of the Kingdom having 152 shrines instead of the 120 in Breath of the Wild. However, these are somehow not even the worst offenders of the shrine issue in Tears of the Kingdom, as the blessing shrines are somehow even worse in Tears of the Kingdom than they were in Breath of the Wild. In Breath of the Wild, most of the blessing shrines were rewards for completing a more in-depth and lengthy quest in Hyrule. While there was nothing in the actual shrine itself that was a challenge, the interest came from figuring out how to complete the shrine quest to unlock the shrine. Most of these quests were at the very least unique, and some of them were actually very enjoyable to complete, with the shrines simply serving as a reward for the quest. As I touched upon in my section about the Sky Islands, the blessing shrines in Tears of the Kingdom are nothing more than the same copy-pasted thing again and again. There are 10 different Sky Crystal shrines. There's nothing interesting about these quests. There's nothing unique about them. Other than that one shrine that randomly tilts sideways for some reason, but that's hardly much different. I will say, I much prefer the look of the Tears of the Kingdom blessing shrines to the normal shrines, and even the Breath of the Wild shrines. I really like the magical feeling the background gives off in them, but the repetitive nature of unlocking these shrines makes them feel incredibly bland and, like the tutorial shrines, just filler. The greater number of shrines doesn't help Tears of the Kingdom. It only hurts the game with more filler than there needed to be. The Zelda series is a series that is known for its dungeons. Each Zelda game, no matter how good or bad, typically gets everyone to agree that the dungeons were at least good. Other than Ocarina of Time, if you know, you know. Breath of the Wild was really the first 3D Zelda game where the dungeons polarized people. A lot of people really dislike the Divine Beasts for being non-linear, simple, and most of all, people dislike how they aren't distinct from one another. While I agree that the Divine Beasts could do with some more variation between them, I actually really like the Divine Beasts as dungeons. The non-linear nature of them complements Breath of the Wild perfectly, and allows for so much freedom in how you complete each beast. The entire concept of controlling a giant robotic animal is incredibly unique and allows for more creative and interesting dungeon design as you move each beast to solve different puzzles. Of course, the puzzles aren't anything too complicated or tightly designed as previous Zelda games, but I think that's an almost impossible task with a game designed around giving the player the utmost freedom to do anything they wish. The Blight boss fights are admittedly repetitive in design and rather simple to defeat, but I really like how each Blight is an extension of Calamity Ganon, fused together with Sheikah technology. It makes you feel like you're taking out a little part of Ganon each time, and actually weakening him as you go through the game, which contributes to making each Divine Beast completion feel like a great step forward on the quest to defeat the Calamity. This sense of progression is further compounded by the freed Divine Beasts leaving a permanent mark on Hyrule, as each completed beast points a giant red laser right at Hyrule Castle, ready to strike when needed. Having these lasers pointed towards the final goal constantly throughout your playthrough really adds to the sense of progression and turning the tide against Calamity Ganon, while also being subtle enough to not become distracting. I really like how the Divine Beasts were handled in Breath of the Wild, and despite me liking the Divine Beasts, many people don't agree with my sentiments towards them. And Nintendo saw the criticism that people gave the Divine Beasts and attempted to go for a more traditional dungeon design with Tears of the Kingdom. The dungeons in Tears of the Kingdom have a much more in-depth and detailed lead-up phase than Breath of the Wild had, and I actually think that these sections of the game are far better than their Breath of the Wild counterparts. The ascent to the Wind Temple is a portion of Tears of the Kingdom that everyone remembers for good reason. Not only is it one of the rare times you get to slowly climb your way into the sky, but you do it while jumping from ship to ship off giant trampolines as you climb up a giant snowstorm. The Water Temple has a similar climb section, but it's much less grandiose than the Wind Temple. Instead of climbing a giant storm, you're climbing up a weird area with low gravity. The story reason for this, as far as I recall, is simply just not explained, but that doesn't stop the low gravity from being a fun and interesting mechanic that I also greatly enjoyed. They attempt to go with the more traditional Zelda dungeon design while also maintaining the freedom of the open world Zelda format. The temples of Tears of the Kingdom fall flat in my eyes. The design of each temple is actually unique and visually distinct from each other, but the atmosphere of Divine Beasts is completely lost. The temples, with the notable exception of the Wind Temple, all feel a bit generic and lacking in any character. While the Divine Beasts may have lacked in unique visuals, they more than made up for it with their setting and story implications. The Tears of the Kingdom temples are just kind of there. They feel artificially placed into the world, while the Divine Beasts felt like a dynamic part of the world that changed and reacted to your progression throughout the game. The bosses within each temple make me feel almost exactly the same way that the temples themselves make me feel, once again with the notable exception of Colgera in the Wind Temple. The bosses of Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons feel very forgettable. Beating these bosses doesn't have the same impact that beating one of the Blights in Breath of the Wild did, despite it being more visually and mechanically unique. The lasting impact completion of these temples makes is clearing up some bad weather in each area. That's not a joke. You clean up some bad weather, or as the game puts it, natural phenomena, it all ends up falling a bit flat. I appreciate what Nintendo tried to do with the dungeons of Tears of the Kingdom. I appreciate that they took on board our criticism of the Divine Beasts and tried to make something better, but unfortunately, I think that they ultimately failed. Okay, look, right, Guardians are just really cool. This entire section of the video is literally going to be dedicated to me just gushing over how much I love Guardians, and why Gloomhands don't even come close to filling the role that Guardians filled. Guardians are such a large part of Breath of the Wild's image. When you think of Breath of the Wild, there's a very good chance that Guardians are one of the first things that come to mind. These giant mechanical nightmares are a beautiful crossing of ancient Sheikah technology and Calamity Ganon's malice. What was once the protecting army of Hyrule, used to beat back the Calamity, has been turned into the greatest threat Hyrule has ever seen. Towering robots with 6 mechanical legs crawling around the map, and you'll always know if one spotted you, even if you can't spot it, because of the iconic music that plays when one sees you. Everyone is familiar with this piano, and it instills a similar feeling of fear that creeper hissing manages to give people. That is an incredibly powerful feeling to be given by a video game, and it takes an exceptional level of design to achieve this effect. Other than creeper hissing, I can't think of another example of an enemy in a video game that causes such a visceral and universal reaction in players. The lore and presentation of Guardians is absolutely top-notch, the gold standard for how an enemy should be presented. They're rare enough so that they aren't a burden on the player, but they appear just frequently enough when you least expect it to surprise you every single time, and cause the initial reaction to their presence to be panic. Guardians are not supposed to be something you can defeat without strong weapons. They are something to be avoided, as an encounter with one means almost certain death for weak and inexperienced players. The high speed, long range, and massive damage Guardians have all make them speeding trains with a laser stuck on top of them. Even late into the game, with some of the strongest armor you can find, a Guardian's laser will still deal several hearts of damage to Link, meaning that they are always a constant and considerable threat, no matter how strong you become. If you haven't played Breath of the Wild before, you might genuinely think that Guardians are unkillable beasts that ruin the experience with an unfair amount of stats, but Nintendo was incredibly smart with how they designed the counterplay to Guardians. There are so many different ways to approach a Guardian encounter, and all of them are more mechanically complex than simply just walking up to one and smacking it with whatever weapon has the largest number. Guardians have one main weakness that can be exploited by anyone: their eye. Shooting a Guardian's eye will completely stun them. They'll stop moving, they'll stop charging their laser, and they'll even lose aggression on Link. Depending on how you want to approach the encounter, this can be used as a tool to escape the Guardian and run away during the short window you get given, or this can be used to get in close to the Guardian and begin fighting it one-on-one. If you want to kill a Guardian with traditional combat, then shooting the eye is a requirement, because without some form of stun, it's almost impossible to hit a moving Guardian. Guardians are about as fast as Link while sprinting, and they're coded to keep a certain distance from Link at all times. Nintendo made it so that this distance is just enough so that you can't hit the Guardian with your weapons, and if you try closing the gap, Guardians will move away from you as fast as you move towards it. How do you deal with this if you can't hit them? You can individually attack the Guardian's legs and cut them off. The more legs you cut off, the slower the Guardian will move. Cut them all off, and it becomes a sitting duck. After legs are cut off, the threat a Guardian poses is massively reduced, and you can start smacking it as much as you please. But of course, there's another way to deal with Guardians. A method of destroying them with such efficiency it can be done with nothing but a pot lid. Of course, I'm talking about parrying the laser. Parrying a Guardian's laser is what makes these enemies feel so amazing to fight. The timing for the parry takes a little bit of getting used to, but once you learn it, you can begin to view Guardians as valuable resources rather than a machine of death. Parrying a laser back at a Guardian will typically deal 500 damage. Hi, yeah, editing me here. That's not 500 damage. I never knew this, but why does it do 604 damage? That is such an oddly specific number, but whatever, my next point still stands. 1/3 the health of a Guardian Stalker. This is such a large number that it's almost impossible to achieve with conventional weapons. Done right, a parry takes 0 shield durability to perform, but this huge reward is balanced out by the massive damage your shield will take if you miss the parry. A missed parry will lead to one of two things: either you die, or your shield breaks. Every single shield other than the Ancient Shield and the Hylian Shield will break after just 1 or 2 Guardian lasers, which makes going for a parry a huge risk, because if you miss, you lose an entire shield. On top of all this, parrying a Guardian's laser is one of the most satisfying things to pull off in the entire game, with the world slowing down around you to highlight the fact that, yeah, I just reflected this giant laser. The devs knew that this mechanic was cool as fuck, and they wanted to make sure that you felt cool as fuck using it. Guardians are one of the most deep and interesting encounters in the entire game. One Guardian is a fun fight, but having to encounter multiple Guardians at once is even more enjoyable. I mention this specifically because you can parry several Guardians at once using a simple exploit. Swapping shields after a shield bash resets the cooldown of the bash, so swapping shields after a Guardian parry means you can instantly parry another Guardian, which is what allows for incredible clips like this one. If this isn't cool, then I don't know what is. Of course, Guardians couldn't stick around in Tears of the Kingdom. They were made for Breath of the Wild and it would feel lazy to reuse them in the sequel. Plus, since they were controlled by Calamity Ganon, it wouldn't make much sense to have them still walking around Hyrule hostile towards Link. But Tears of the Kingdom does make an attempt to fill the void that Guardians left. Gloom Hands. On a first encounter, Gloom Hands managed to perfectly capture that feeling of panic and fear that Guardians managed to create in Breath of the Wild. Turning around after the sky goes red and the creepy vocals begin playing, only to see a bunch of screaming hands speeding towards you, is enough to freak anyone out. Gloom Hands, much like Guardians, are fast, tanky, and very powerful, but the key difference between them and Guardians is the counterplay, or lack thereof in the case of Gloom Hands. Gloom Hands attack Link by speeding towards him faster than he can run, and once they get in range, they grab Link, removing control from the player. This would be fine if there weren't 5 of them. Oh, and they also respawn if you don't kill them all fast enough. Like Guardians, traditional combat is out of the question with these guys because they'll just grab you. They have eyes like Guardians that will stun them after being shot, but because there's 5 hands, it's significantly harder to completely stun the enemy and make an escape. The lack of proper stun means that unless you manage to run outside their despawn radius, you have to fight these things, which would be fine if they had just as much counterplay as Guardians, but from my experience, they simply don't. The way I typically deal with Gloom Hands is by climbing the nearest wall, going into bullet time, and spraying the hands with enough arrows to kill 700 bokoblins. That's the only way I deal with them, and to be honest, I don't see a better way or even another way that isn't just frustrating. After killing Gloom Hands, of course, that's not the end. Phantom Ganon spawns after killing Gloom Hands. Every single time. It's not a rare chance, it's every single time. The boss fight isn't bad or anything, but it gets really old really fast. I'm gonna gloss over the fact that Phantom Ganon is a boss you fight in the main storyline, and also the fact that he shares half a moveset with the final boss, which completely spoils and undermines both of those fights. I'm not a fan of Phantom Ganon spawning after the defeat of the Gloom Hands. The last thing I want to talk about in this surprisingly long ramble about Guardians and Gloom Hands is the lack of presence Gloom Hands have. Guardians with big, glowing robots that patrolled the map, and they stood out like a sore thumb in the best way possible. Gloom Hands have zero presence at all. They literally rise from what looks like seemingly normal ground. I understand that this was done to make the encounter less predictable and feel more threatening due to the element of surprise, but all it does is it just removes the presence from the game. In Breath of the Wild, you were always acutely aware of Guardians walking around the map, but in Tears of the Kingdom, it's incredibly easy to forget that Gloom Hands exist until they just randomly appear from the floor. Gloom Hands are less enjoyable to interact with, less interesting from a lore and story perspective, and just nowhere near as cool as Guardians. The Legend of Zelda is a series renowned for its rich story present within almost every game in the series. Ask any Zelda fan what their favourite Zelda story is and you'll get several different answers. Some people will answer with Ocarina of Time with its several different paths and endings. Some people will say Majora's Mask with its dark and despair-filled world. Some people will say the second game. They're a bit weird. What you won't hear anyone answer with, however, is either Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom. Both of the open world Zelda games are lacking in their story. I don't think that the story in either game is particularly bad, but when they're stacked up against the Zelda series, they end up falling short. This is understandable. The new open world format brought by Breath of the Wild means that Nintendo had to craft a story that could be uncovered at any time, anywhere, in any order. And as a result, it simply couldn't be as deep as previous Zelda games. Nintendo solved this issue by making the story of Breath of the Wild told through Link uncovering lost memories of his past. This method of storytelling gives context to why the story is told out of order, and for the most part, I actually like how the memory system in Breath of the Wild is carried out. Link discovers lost memories when he travels to locations which had significant importance to his past. Once discovering a lost memory, a short cutscene will play that will give some insight into either Link and Zelda's relationship or the Great Calamity 100 years ago. Watching Zelda warm to Link as they spend time together gives a huge amount of character to her that is typically missing from most Zelda games. It gives the player a reason to care about the disembodied voice that appears in Link's head every so often and reaffirms that, no, Link isn't schizophrenic. I'm personally much more interested in the Great Calamity and the fall of Hyrule 100 years ago. The lack of any substantial story means that there are a lot of gaps about what we know with the Calamity, and it leaves a lot of room for speculation and headcanons, while being just enough story to lead us all down a similar path of theorizing. The scenes of converted guardians terrorizing Hyrule and causing utter chaos and destruction wherever they go made me feel genuinely interested in the story of Breath of the Wild and yearning to learn even more about how Hyrule fell. This was a disappointment. We don't talk about this. The non-linear storytelling in Breath of the Wild works very well for the type of game Breath of the Wild is. It's not the most complex story, it's not the best story, but I think it fits the game very well. As with almost everything in Tears of the Kingdom, Nintendo decided to tell the game's story in almost the exact same way as Breath of the Wild. I've just praised the non-linear storytelling in Breath of the Wild, but it simply does not work for the kind of story Tears of the Kingdom is trying to tell. Nintendo clearly wanted to put a much greater focus on the story of Tears of the Kingdom, the intro sequence being a 10 solid minute long bout of exposition and lore dumping should make that much obvious. The main story of the game has a narrative that won't make much sense if you discover it out of order, which is the main issue the story of Tears of the Kingdom has. The random mishmash of memories in Breath of the Wild made sense because it was contextualized within Link discovering his memories, and Nintendo crafted the memories with this in mind. You can discover the memories in almost any order and have the story make sense. You simply can't do that with Tears of the Kingdom. But first, having the memories in Tears of the Kingdom all be within these giant geoglyphs is much better than how the memories were hinted to you in Breath of the Wild. These geoglyphs make the locations of the memories easy to locate and removes the frustration that came with trying to pinpoint the location of the memory images on the giant game's map. The geoglyphs make a grand total of about 0 sense, but they're at very least interesting to look at. The problem with them is you won't find them in chronological order for a story that almost requires you to find it in chronological order. Experiencing Tears of the Kingdom story out of order leaves you at best questioning what on earth you just watched, and at worst completely spoils the main twist of the game. The entire story experienced through the geoglyphs is leading up to the big reveal of Zelda's ultimate sacrifice when she swallows her secret stone and transforms into the Light Dragon. But odds are, you're going to figure that out long before you find all the geoglyphs, so the entire story about trying to solve the mystery of what happened to Zelda, you're just sat there knowing what happened to Zelda, so it's just completely lost on you. It baffles me that Nintendo would implement the story in this way. They must have known that doing it like this would essentially spoil their own story by simply playing the game. I mean, if you decide to take a closer look at the Light Dragon early into the game, you could easily discover the Master Sword is just sitting on the Light Dragon well before that's revealed in the story. The story itself isn't bad. It takes a much more plot-focused approach than Breath of the Wild, and for that reason it leads you without the speculation and the questions that you were left with in Breath of the Wild. The plot is pretty good for the most part, with it depicting Ganondorf's rise to power as the Demon King. Why he wishes to destroy all of Hyrule is never actually explained, but to be fair, when is it ever explained? Outside of that one time in Skyward Sword when they decided to explain it? That game's a bit weird. Anyway, of course, the one major standout blunder made by the story in Tears of the Kingdom are the cutscenes with the Sage Descendants you get after every completed temple. For whatever reason, Nintendo decided to reuse the same little bit of exposition word for word 4 separate times. The biggest difference between these cutscenes is the sound of the voice retelling the story. I can't even begin to think of a reason as to why Nintendo decided to do this. They had 6 years between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. They even delayed Tears of the Kingdom to really polish the game as much as possible, and you're telling me this is the best they could come up with? I don't know why they wouldn't slowly reveal more details about the imprisoning war as you complete more temples. The concept of the imprisoning war is really interesting, and I wish it was expanded upon more. Because currently all we have is a basic overview. All we know about the imprisoning war is the sages, Zelda, and Rauru fought Ganondorf for an unspecified amount of time and eventually lost, so Rauru sealed himself and Ganondorf away under Hyrule Castle. That's all we get told, and we get told it 4 times. For a game that promised to give a greater focus on story, Tears of the Kingdom completely misses the bar. While the actual story itself has a lot more meat on its bones than Breath of the Wild, the method of delivery and the bizarre choices Nintendo made completely ruins anything good the story may have had. I like Calamity Ganon. I'm gonna get a lot of flack for this, but this is my video, so suck it. You're in this deep already, the sunk cost fallacy is already set in. I think Calamity Ganon is a better boss fight than Ganondorf. Now let me explain. Calamity Ganon is a very easy boss fight. It almost has to be, so at least it's possible to beat it fresh off the plateau, since that was the whole point of Breath of the Wild. I like Calamity Ganon because it feels like a cinematic end that complements the journey you've been through to get there. As soon as the battle starts, all 4 Divine Beasts finally swing into action, or, well, however many Divine Beasts you've actually beaten, and they shoot their lasers at the Calamity, removing upwards of half its health before the fight even begins. This greatly rewards actually going out and exploring the world, saving the Divine Beasts, freeing the champion spirits, and making you feel like you're not fighting Ganon alone. This fight itself has a huge variety of different attacks, with a lot of the attacks being buffed versions of the Blight Elemental attacks. Calamity Ganon feels like an amalgamation of all the bosses you've fought throughout your adventure, and then some. And I like that. I like that a lot. The fight is pretty easy though, I'm not going to sit here and tell you it's the greatest boss fight ever. It's okay. It fits Breath of the Wild, and I like the presentation. The Demon King just doesn't have that same feeling of your adventure coming together. The fight begins before the fight actually begins, with this long descent sequence down Hyrule Castle. This descent phase is a mixed bag for me. On one hand, I love the fact that Ganondorf is hiding in the deepest, darkest part of the depths, right below Hyrule Castle. If you recall from the very beginning of the game, Ganondorf actually fell into the depths right at the end of the opening cutscene, and I love the fact that you have to physically descend down and go to him to start the fight. The music building up as you go deeper, and the surroundings being the old ruins of the castle until you find yourself walking the same steps you walked in the prelude, makes the descent feel like a very cyclic thing to move through, and I mean that in a good way. The mixed part comes in with the enemies you have to go through on your way down to Ganondorf. Having a large enemy gauntlet before the final boss isn't the issue here. Hyrule Castle in Breath of the Wild was absolutely littered with guardians and strong enemies to make the approach to Ganon feel more climactic. The gauntlet in Tears of the Kingdom is an annoyance, because the descent is in the depths, and all the enemies in the depths are covered in gloom. And all of the enemies covered in gloom cap your health every time they hit you. And the only way to remove this is to bring special food. If you didn't know that the enemies will be covered in gloom, which you probably won't, then odds are you won't have any gloom restoring food with you. Which means that by the time you reach Ganondorf, all the hearts you worked to get over the course of playing the game are probably gone. This issue is just exacerbated by the massive gauntlet of enemies that spawns right as you reach the door to Ganondorf. Spawning this many enemies makes it almost guaranteed that you're gonna get hit at least a few times. My first time going through the end of the game, I entered with about 20 hearts, and then by the time I reached Ganondorf, I had 6 left, which made the fight itself incredibly frustrating as I would just die in 1 or 2 hits. So I had to reload my save because for some reason you can't leave this area. I had to come back better prepared, and then I gave the fight an actual shot. The fight with Ganondorf is more challenging than Calamity Ganon, but it lacks the same feeling that Calamity Ganon gave me. The Calamity Ganon fight is this giant mess of malice and Sheikah technology that uses attacks from all 4 of the Blights to try turning Link into a red paste on the floor. Ganondorf is constantly hyped up as this unbeatable king of evil that is just so powerful nobody could even touch him. Then you get to the fight itself, and he's just kind of like a dude with a sword. The fight is a one-on-one sword fight with Ganondorf. There's nothing wrong with that, but it lacks the grandiose nature of Calamity Ganon. The first phase of the fight is particularly underwhelming because it's almost identical to the Phantom Ganon fights that I spoke about earlier when talking about the Gloom Hands. Having the final boss be so similar to a normal mini-boss that spawns naturally around the map just takes away from the final fight so much. When I've already fought the final boss 15 times before fighting the final boss, suddenly it's not very special anymore. The second phase of the boss fight definitely steps things up a lot. The fight gets at least 3 points for the health bar transition being really funny. I think this was probably intended to be like intimidating and to display just how strong Ganondorf is, but personally I just thought it was really funny. The second phase mirrors the Phantom Ganon boss fight. Yes, he's a boss, and yes, he's also a mini-boss, but the final boss mimics the boss fight that you do in the Sanctum. It's just roll with it. Ganondorf spawns 4 clones of himself to make the battle a 5v1. This would be a very interesting change of pace for a fight that has been a complete one-on-one thus far, but as soon as Ganondorf spawns his clones, the 4 Sage Descendants show up to assist you in the battle against Ganondorf. Each Sage takes on one of the Ganon clones, leaving Ganondorf himself up to you. So why spawn the clones? You don't have to fight them. They don't even fight you, because they take on 1 Sage each. It would have been much more interesting to have all of the Sages and Link go up against Ganondorf himself, and turn the tide of a battle from a 5v1 to a 1v5. But the fight very quickly takes another turn when all of the Ganon clones just disappear alongside the Sages to return back to a one-on-one fight with Link and Ganon. So I don't understand why bring all the Sages if they're just going to be gone in a matter of seconds? Why bring in the clones if they get distracted and then disappear? This entire phase of the boss fight just feels unnecessary in every way, and I don't understand why it's in the game the way it is. Once the clones and Sages go away, the one-on-one fighting comes back, but this time, Ganondorf has a couple new moves involving Gloom which permanently remove hearts from Link. It only removes 1 heart at a time, so they're not very powerful. Again, I don't really see the point here, but I digress. This phase of the boss fight is probably the best one, as Ganondorf could actually flurry rush your flurry rushes. He could do this throughout the entire fight, but it sort of just like adds on to the climactic feeling that the final phase has. I love the idea that the enemy being able to use one of your own mechanics against you, and I think it was actually executed very well. The Ganondorf fight is harder than Calamity Ganon, and I can understand why people like Ganondorf more, but me personally, I think Calamity Ganon is the superior fight. The Demon Dragon is no contest, however. It absolutely clears Dark Beast Cannon. And there isn't much to talk about with either of these fights because they're designed to be more of a spectacle and not an actual fight, but the Demon Dragon being a battle in the sky after Ganondorf, out of desperation, swallows his secret stone and turns himself into a dragon is such an amazing spectacle. Having the Light Dragon come to your aid to give you the height you need to get on top of the Demon Dragon in order to destroy it is an incredible ending to the game, and it absolutely clears the Dark Beast Ganon battle in every way. The ending spectacle to Tears of the Kingdom is an absolute highlight of the game, and Nintendo closed out this game with what I would consider to be a series high in terms of spectacle. If you know anything about me, then you'll know that I am a massive fan of Ultra Kill, an indie movement shooter made by Hikita. Go play it, by the way. The key word here is movement. I love games with good movement, varied movement, fast movement, and interesting movement. The Zelda series is definitely not what comes to mind when you think of good movement in video games. The most advanced movement tech Zelda has had is just like rolling around in a field pretending to be Sonic the Hedgehog until you go from point A to point B. Breath of the Wild is a notable exception in this regard, but not intentionally. Breath of the Wild has a huge amount of different movement exploits and glitches that entirely enhance the game's experience. I've already spoken in depth about how much I love wind bombing, but that's not the only mechanic players can exploit to get around Hyrule in ways the developers could have never imagined. Bullet time bouncing, or a BTB, is a movement exploit that abuses the fact that when in bullet time, the game's physics is cranked up to 11. Performing this exploit is really simple. Take an enemy that can ragdoll, shield surf onto its head in bullet time, and sit back and watch as Link flies halfway across the map. This is much more situational than wind bombing, but I'd be lying if I said it wasn't incredibly entertaining, and chaining together BTBs is one of the most satisfying things to pull off in any Zelda game. Bow Lift Smuggle Slide, or BLSS, is another movement exploit you can perform in Breath of the Wild, and it's literally just like Minecraft creative mode flight without the height aspect. It's not an exaggeration. It literally gives Link infinite flight with incredibly high speeds. The only downside it has is you can't change your height unless you bash your head into a light slope. Personally, I am not a huge fan of BLSS. It's not as flashy and it's not as interesting as other exploits like wind bombing and BTBs, but I know that it's many players' primary movement option because it's incredibly fast, incredibly convenient, and very easy to pull off. Plus, it looks pretty goofy. There's all sorts of other little movement exploits in Breath of the Wild, like whistle running, allowing you to have permanent sprint, or moon jumping, allowing you to gain infinite height. And all of these mechanics put together gives you such a large wealth of choices for how you can move around in Hyrule. And then Tears of the Kingdom just has this fucking bike. Yeah, it's time. Yeah, we're talking about the hover bike. This little bike initially seems like an amazing vehicle anyone can create. It's cheap, it's simple, and it's incredibly versatile. For all intents and purposes, the hover bike is an amazing example of why the Tears of the Kingdom vehicle system is an incredible feat of game design. One vehicle that can do almost anything. The hover bike is fast, it can move in all directions, on all axes, It's small, so you can fit into tight spots that other vehicles might not be able to. It only uses 2 fans, so the battery usage is low, and you can use it to solve so many vehicle-related side quests and also the little Korok side quests. The biggest strength of the hoverbike is its biggest weakness. The hoverbike is too versatile. The incredible flexibility and the cheap cost of the hoverbike makes the entire vehicle building system completely irrelevant, because most, if not all problems, all have the same solution. The hoverbike is simply better than anything else you can create using Ultra Hand, which makes the entire system feel useless. Why spend time crafting a unique and interesting vehicle when you can just instantly snap together a hoverbike that will probably perform better than whatever you can come up with? The hoverbike is better than anything else you can create, and auto build letting you spawn one in whenever you please for practically pennies does not help make the bike feel any less stale. While Breath of the Wild is over here with a massive wealth of different movement techniques that the player can choose from, Tears of the Kingdom has only one real choice, because Nintendo has gone out of their way to patch out anything interesting that this game has. So what we're left with is the only thing that can really solve all of our problems. All we have is the hoverbike. I don't play Breath of the Wild like a normal person. I am well aware that jumping through walls, removing Link's hair and doing whatever the fuck this is, isn't how normal people play this game. So this section most likely won't resonate with as many people as maybe the last few sections had, but I am a firm believer that Breath of the Wild is a game that is made by how broken it is. Usually, calling a game broken or glitchy isn't a good thing, but Breath of the Wild manages to accidentally strike a perfect balance of having glitches that are interesting, fun to pull off, not too complicated to pull off, and something that you won't experience unless you actively go out and look for them. The unintended things you can do in Breath of the Wild only serve to enhance the experience of the game by giving the player even more freedom to play the game however they want, in a game designed to give the player freedom to play the game however they want. I have never played a game that is simultaneously so unbelievably broken, and yet broken in a way that makes the game so much better. I mean, seriously, how on earth did people discover that if you throw a bunch of bows on the floor, suddenly Link becomes a floating head and you can duplicate weapons? The methods of which you exploit Breath of the Wild are so outlandish that it's almost impossible to discover them if you're just playing the game casually. And yet the setups to perform them are so simple and easily repeatable. It makes the process of performing these exploits actually enjoyable and feel like more of a mechanic than an exploit. To put this in context, the method for jumping through almost any wall in the game is literally as simple as shield surfing on a slope, and then shield surfing into a wall. That's it. Wanna jump through that wall? Find a slope. Simple, easy, repeatable, very funny. There's such a large number of different exploits in Breath of the Wild that reach across every aspect of the game, from movement, to combat, to item exploitation, to literally creating a New Game Plus save within a game that doesn't have a New Game Plus mode. I want to highlight one exploit in particular to just gush about for a brief moment. I want to talk about the Thunderclap Rush. The Thunderclap Rush is actually a combination of two different things. The first part is having an enemy hit your shield. What this does is it sets an invisible marker on that enemy for the game to target when you do a flurry rush. This is where the second part of the Thunderclap Rush comes into play. You can flurry rush anywhere, anytime in Breath of the Wild. This is an incredibly simple exploit to pull off. First, find a small ledge to jump off, then tap the ZR and Y buttons at the same time. That's it. Once you land, if done correctly, you should just do a flurry rush for seemingly no reason. Combining these two mechanics means you can flurry rush wherever you want, and your flurry rush will be locked onto an enemy that might be quite far away. To compensate for this, the game will just zip link right towards the enemy from wherever you are, straight into the enemy's face to make sure that the flurry rush connects. That's what a thunderclap rush is. An incredibly easy to perform, incredibly flashy combat mechanic that's only possible through the use of exploits. This is why I love Breath of the Wild. I love Breath of the Wild for everything you're not meant to be able to do. That's why I was all the more disappointed when Nintendo decided to remove any and all exploits discovered in Tears of the Kingdom. I understand why they were removed, but it doesn't mean I'm happy about it. On release, Tears of the Kingdom was an incredibly broken game, and not in a good way, which prompted Nintendo to start patching out all of the many glitches of this game, both good and bad. A lot of very easy item duplication and game overloading exploits were patched, which I think is a good thing. But a lot of incredibly unique and interesting exploits reminiscent of Breath of the Wild also got caught in the crossfire. Glitches like bow jumping, shield smuggling, and teleporting the Master Sword through time to duplicate it all got removed within weeks. You might argue that patching bugs is a good thing, but I would argue that we lost some incredibly interesting exploits that would have made the experience for those who wanted to play around with them that much better. As things stand, me and my MSG not found prefer how utterly broken Breath of the Wild is. I want to just briefly talk about the difference in performance between Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom before this video comes to its end. Breath of the Wild does not run very well on the Switch. The game is just so large to the point that this tiny little system can't handle it very well. The Zelda devs did an outstanding job at getting Breath of the Wild to run as well as it does. For the most part, Breath of the Wild looks amazing. It has loading times that aren't too bad, and it holds a stable, if low, frame rate. Mostly. Tears of the Kingdom is obviously much larger than Breath of the Wild, and once again it's amazing that this game runs at all on a console as old and as weak as the Switch. But the increased size does come at a cost. The quick swap menus in Tears of the Kingdom have a little bit of map when changing weapons, bows or shields that just isn't present in Breath of the Wild. It's a small thing, but it's very noticeable in game. The loading times in Tears of the Kingdom are pretty bad. Booting the game can take several minutes, fast travelling is noticeably slower than in Breath of the Wild, and when loading into the depths, Link will literally just freeze in mid-air while Hyrule unloads and the depths loads in. I like the fact that the depths has a seamless loading screen where you just jump into the hole, go through and boom, you're in the depths, no loading screen. But the Switch simply is not powerful enough to warrant such a system being in this game. The performance issues aren't an issue of Tears of the Kingdom. They're more of an issue with the Switch's age and the lack of power. Zelda developers made a game that was too strong for the system that they were putting it on. Tears of the Kingdom feels like a game that should have been released on the Switch's successor and not the Switch. Tears of the Kingdom is too powerful for the Switch, and the system the game is on holds it back to an unfortunately large degree. This video has been pretty negative overall, but I do want to stress that I don't think Tears of the Kingdom is a bad game. Quite the contrary. Tears of the Kingdom is one of the best games I've ever played, and all of the critical acclaim and praise it received is absolutely deserved. The reason I've been so critical of this game is because it's not a normal game. Tears of the Kingdom is the sequel to one of the best games I have ever played, one of my favourite games of all time, and potentially one of the greatest games ever made, full stop. It's impossible to play Tears of the Kingdom without comparing it to Breath of the Wild because the games are just so similar. They're so alike that you cannot play one without thinking about the other. Tears of the Kingdom had massive shoes to fill, and I think it falls short of filling the role as the sequel to Breath of the Wild. If it was any normal game, I would praise everything amazing about it, but because it's the sequel to Breath of the Wild, I can only compare it to its predecessor. I really wanted to like Tears of the Kingdom more than Breath of the Wild, but as time has passed since the game's release, I realised more and more that I had issues with Tears of the Kingdom that I simply don't have with Breath of the Wild. Over time, I, like many people, realized that I simply like Breath of the Wild more. I realized that Breath of the Wild is better. I realized that Tears of the Kingdom had ultimately failed as a sequel. Thanks for watching.